What's up guys, and in today's video I'm going to be going through how we're designing self-healing infrastructure in terms of Killer Chaos OS. Today's video is going to be a fun one. It's going to be more of an in-depth guide or detail into it. So like always with these videos, the main mission is to show our builds raw and real, to show you the good, the bad, the ugly, what it is that we're actively implementing in terms of mental models, how we're scaling those mental models into the future, also just to solve what hurts, basically to come into businesses and organizations and to be the chief problem solvers and ultimately just build back-end infrastructure off of it. And also just to call in visionaries, basically people that are aligned with what it is that we're actively doing, just building, and also just to build a network of cool people doing cool things at the same time. So like always, I decided to try something new and just go a bit more in depth. So like always, most tools tell you something's broken, and you probably do expect this to say, hey, a tool tells you XYZ is broken, but we're building to fix itself before you even know that there's a fire. So basically building that predictive analysis tool to say, hey, Killer Chaos OS, the main overarching goal or the main mission for Killer Chaos OS is ultimately to fix itself before you even know what's going on, and ultimately just give you the solutions that you can possibly take, or the actionables to say, hey, we need to take XYZ actionables to solve this before it even spirals out of control, giving you full control over the entire ops overview within the business infrastructure, and saying, hey, it's more than just automation, just saying, hey, we're building a deeper layer than just automation. We're making sure that we're building early architecture, which I call the self-healing infrastructure. So basically self-healing infrastructure that heals itself, it's in the name, to say, hey, this infrastructure needs to be centered around self-healing, and how can we actively build this infrastructure for the future? We just need to think about it. And this is how I am basically breaking down how we're thinking about it, how we're going to be implementing certain things into the future, and also just thinking and acting and building mental models. So like always, the big picture or the big main idea for this is from reactive to intelligence ops. So basically to build that intelligence in terms of operations, to basically say, hey, we don't want to focus on reactive operations, we want to turn reactive into intelligent. And how can we constantly do that? How can we think about doing this? And how can we then say, hey, when you scale, chaos isn't a bug, it is inevitable. To say each and every time that you're scaling or a business scales, they're going to be facing a lot more bugs, and that is just inevitable. And how can you combat this? By basically installing intelligent ops, from the way that I see it, to say, hey, how can we actively just implement it when vendors ghost, budgets balloon, and deadlines slip? How can we actively just implement intelligence within their current infrastructure so that it is basically self-healing? And how do we say from traditional ops, or how do we combat the notion to say, hey, traditional ops says let's get alerts before something breaks or when something breaks. We're basically turning that into saying, hey, let's build systems that fix themselves or prevent the break entirely, to say, hey, how can we actively solve this break, or how can we actively build for it before it actually happens, and how can we make it self-healing such that so it gives our clients the full control that they need over their ops infrastructure, which is going to be super hard problem to solve. But I know that just laying down the MVPs and ultimately just building for the future, that we're ultimately just going to refine the machine and get closer to that source of truth, which is actively just building Killer Chaos OS into the beast that we ultimately see it to be, and saying, hey, this is going to take time, it's going to take a ton of iterations, so we're just going to build it, and then we're going to just keep on learning from it each and every single day to turn this from, hey, reactive ops to intelligent ops, because you want to implement a intelligence brain into your system, and ultimately having this that ultimately then allows you to then not take a reactive approach but an intelligent approach that says, hey, we need to make sure that it is self-healing, so that it kind of makes you also be able to solve the problems within your current infrastructure without actively having to start from scratch each and every single time, to say, hey, let's react to this, basically having that self-healing membrane or just its own brain, ops brain, and then just injecting that into the builds that we're making. Still a long way, but we're ultimately just going to get there. But we ultimately just need to keep pushing the needle forward and pushing the boundaries of what we think is impossible today into a new realm of possibility tomorrow. So we're not just building automation, so we're not just stacking automations on top of each other. We are building data aware, decision aware systems, ultimately saying, hey, these systems need to be able to make decisions, and they need to be able to take the best route that is for the systems and also for the company, to say, hey, based on historical data, we need to make sure that we're making decisions, or it makes decisions that ultimately benefit the business in the long term and not cause harm in the long term as well. To say, hey, what is the cost benefit, or what is the opportunity cost, and how can we have the best possibility of success in that? And then saying, hey, how these self-healing systems would work, and how we actively think about this, and how we're actively thinking about implementing the stack would basically be, number one, signal mapping, where we're tracking failure indicators, basically understanding what are the key indicators that are going to tell us that, hey, XYZ is failing, and then solely just having that unlocked. So we're going to stage it out and say, hey, we need to make sure that we're building our internal systems to understand that, hey, failure is going to hit at this point based on historical data, and how can we actively think about it, and saying, hey, response lags as well, we need to make sure that we're constantly just understanding how the response lags are, what time delays they are as well, what is the latency on that as well, just making sure that we're hitting each and every single nail in the wall, and we're ultimately just understanding each and every moving part, because ultimately understanding it from first principles is ultimately just going to allow us to unlock a new level of awareness and also a new perspective, that ultimately with the main aim of allowing us to build better products. And I know that we're going to get there, like I always say, but it's going to take some time, but we're actively just going to keep hitting the nail in the wall and solving for it, and saying, hey, duplicate entries as well, which does happen, to say, hey, we need to make sure that we're mapping out the signals and they're able to track duplicate entries, maybe entries within the systems that you may not realize it, or sorry about that, or just even having duplicate names. Each and every single part we need to make sure that we're taking into account, because once we have all the accounts or things or factors that we need to take into account, then we can ultimately just build around that. And saying, hey, missed deadlines, we ultimately just also need to take that into consideration of the points of failures. So basically asking, what are the points of failures within the system, or how can we basically build a general consensus on the points of failures that happen within businesses, and then ultimately say, hey, we have each and every single point of failure dialed, so that when it does indicate, they ultimately understand that, hey, we've used XYZ data, and from our tests and what we've built so far, we know that these points of failures are based on this. And ultimately, we just need to refine that into the future to make sure that we're just actively just building better and scaling better into the future, ultimately just solving problems and building back-end infrastructure off of that. But ultimately, that comes down from signal mapping, which is going to be super key, because we need to understand those indicators in terms of the points of failures, which are going to be super key in understanding how we can actively build these systems into the future. And then saying, hey, an example of this is if a vendor hasn't responded within 48 hours, then we can basically have the system ping both of them. So basically saying, hey, the planner plus offers failure vendor logic. So basically just pinging both of them to say, hey, fallback. So the offers fallback vendor logic, making sure that we're just pinging both sides and that both sides are aware. And then we ultimately just use this historical data to make sure that, hey, we are creating or making sure that we have the best possible routes for success in what it is that we're building, and making sure that we're just ultimately creating value. And I know that tied with number 2, which is predictive triggering, which is going to ultimately be a game changer in my book that we're actively thinking about, and saying, hey, the AI would flag patterns before they collapse into chaos, ultimately saying, hey, we're going to build patterns, or the AI is going to figure out patterns, and we still need to just overall think this through in more detail and specificity, in more specific detail, and ultimately just say, hey, we need to make sure that we're gathering the patterns and ultimately just understanding these patterns for chaos, so that when it does happen, it's able to pick up those patterns and then ultimately just trigger. So ultimately just having those triggers and saying, hey, each planner workflow teaches the system how to prompt fire, how to preempt fire, to ultimately say, hey, each and every single time we're building this, we need to make sure that we're allowing the system to preempt fire, ultimately understanding that, hey, with these specific patterns, it ultimately possibly leads to the vendor flakes or just problems with the entire system that ultimately bleed the business revenue, which is one of the things that we ultimately want to build for. So this is how we just thinking about understand how the strategy would work in terms of how it is that we're building this into the future. And this is just how we're thinking about this, to say, hey, we're thinking through about this, we're still going to refine it, still going to go in more detail and just perfect this, but ultimately we just need to make sure that we have the overall arching goal set down in stone, so that we can actively just think things through, see where we're failing, see where we have good points as well, and ultimately just build around that. Not just saying, hey, we're going to think this through and we're not going to put it on paper, but we're going to put it on paper, but rather we're going to put it on paper and then we're actively just going to build around that and say, hey, number 3, fallback mechanisms, which are going to play such a key role, just ultimately having backups, just basically saying, hey, we're going to build backup protocols, making sure that each and every system that we build has a backup, so that we have fallback measures in place, because I know that into the future fallback measures are going to play such a key role. If one flow, if for example, if one flow fails, then we ultimately have another one that kicks in and saying, hey, auto email, auto delegate, and auto log, ultimately making sure that we have fallback measures. I like to think about this also in terms of planes, like redundancy, to say, hey, planes have so many redundant systems, why can't we also just steal a page from their book to say, hey, planes need to be ultra safe, so why don't we also just incorporate some elements in what it is that we're building for Killer Chaos OS, and saying, hey, how can we actively just implement certain things that we see from the outside world or the real world, and ultimately just have it within Killer Chaos OS. Like I said, it's going to be a super hard challenge, but I know that we're going to figure it out, and we're going to make sure that we get closer to building this new future of back-end infrastructure that we're going to be building. Super exciting, super hard, super exciting, but I know that where hard things lie is where we need to be. So ultimately saying that is going to be what we're going to be building for. It's going to be super hard, but I know we're going to get there. But anyways, saying, hey, and then we also have an example of how we actually think about this, to say, hey, budget overruns detected, then we can ultimately recommend reallocation before things spiral, ultimately saying, hey, we need to make sure that we understand the business from the root core, and ultimately saying, hey, if budgets overrun, we need to understand how we're tracking their finances, where their money is going, and ultimately saying, hey, if the budget is overrunning, then we ultimately need to make sure that we're also giving the option or just creating a measure in place that ultimately allows for relocation to happen, to say reallocation to happen, to ultimately say, hey, we need to make sure that they know that they need to reallocate the budget before it spirals out of control, basically saving them from losing a ton of revenue, and then ultimately saying, hey, we need to, in as much as it's cool to have all these different things, we also need to make sure that we have decision logs, so making sure that we're logging each and every single decision that we make, saying, hey, every auto move is logged in a rationale, ultimately saying, hey, we need to make sure that we're logging each and every single decision, and saying, hey, so the planner can trust what happened and why did we do these specific movements, so that they can say, hey, let's say we spent XYZ portion, we reallocated the budget to, let's say, for example, let's say to the film crew, we allocated more to the film crew rather than to the vendor that was supplying the flowers, and then we say, hey, we made this decision based off of the past time that you didn't pay the vendor, or you didn't pay the film crew, and then ultimately saying, hey, in order to keep them longer, we need to make sure that we're adding incentives in place, and then ultimately just keeping them longer, rather than saying, hey, we're just gonna make sure that we're not gonna, we didn't pay them well last time, that we're not gonna pay them at all, or just relocating the funds. It ultimately just depends, it's use case specific, but we're ultimately just going to think this through and ultimately just refine it as we go. And why this matters is super important. I think from every single thing that I may have articulated or spoken about, I think it all boils down to this, why this matters in terms of beyond technology, and saying, hey, self-healing systems are ultimately going to do 3 things for us, and this is basically going to encompass each and every single thing that I have spoken about today, which is, hey, they scale trust. The number one thing is we ultimately need to make sure that we're building trust points, basically building trust points in every single decisions, basically logging the decisions as well, making sure that we make sure that, hey, no more late night panic texts, ultimately making sure that, hey, our clients are ultimately feeling the peace and relaxation that, hey, their stuff is taken care of, and then that their system has got their back, so that they're not constantly fiddling around saying, oh my days, what is going on, is the system working, what is going on within the system, and ultimately just asking those questions, but rather saying, hey, we need to make sure that we're actively building around this and making sure that we're refining in each and every single component that we're building for, and saying, hey, they make us indispensable, making sure that, hey, anyone can build a dashboard, few can build infrastructure with foresight, basically saying, hey, we're going to make sure that we're going to build infrastructure with foresight at our hand, and ultimately just use that to guide us in what it is that we're doing, and ultimately making sure that it with that it also compounds. With compounding leverage, it also ties hand in hand with what it is that we're doing, in saying, hey, every error handled today becomes data for a smarter move tomorrow, making sure that each and every single day that we're making smarter moves each and every single day, and that this overarching goal, or this overarching thing that we're building, ultimately becomes our moat to say, hey, we need to make sure that we're hitting on all fronts, ultimately refining the process, understanding where we're failing, where we're going to be improving, and also just scaling into the future. So this is a super rough idea or strategy that we're going to be implementing. I know I'm going to be diving a lot deeper into this as time goes on. I just wanted to, just to go over how we're actively thinking about this, but into the future it's going to be more refined, more super dialed, and ultimately just ultimately more dialed in, so that into the future I can go more specific in this. We still have a lot more videos to cover, so I will definitely make a part 2 to this, because I think this is going to be super valuable in terms of how we think about this, how we're actively going to be scaling this into the future, and also just saying, hey, this is the vision, this is the big picture vision, we believe it so much, and we're actively just going to build these self-healing infrastructure. And with time, I know we're going to fail a ton, but we're ultimately gonna get one step closer, because failure is ultimately a data point, and from those data points it allows us to build better insight and also feedback loops that ultimately scale Killer Chaos OS into the future and what it is that we're gonna be doing. So I'm super excited for all the DOSes and all the good things that are gonna be coming with Killer Chaos OS. I am super pumped just having this, and also just gonna be scaling it into the future. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a comment, follow me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram if you guys want to connect, and also just make sure to let me know if you guys want part 2, or if you guys have any questions, just pop them to me on any of those social platforms, and I will see you guys in the next video.